Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to another session of Indian Economy Essentials. And in today's session, let's have a discussion regarding the recent data for the GDP for Indian economy. That is, what has happened to India's GDP in the third quarter for the current financial year. Now, before I start the discussion, here are certain very important announcements. As promised, from 1st of March, we are launching the Target Prelims 2023. That's today, by the way. And in this Target Prelims 2023 initiative, there are four very important components. Please remember the four components. One will be basically having a discussion of strategy that you're supposed to follow for the next 90 days to prepare for each of the subjects. And in this strategy, the faculty will be taking the live questions from the student side. This will be followed by the second component of the program, wherein more than 400 topics will be discussed which are relevant for civil services preliminary examination. This followed by the third component, where we are going to have MCQ discussions, including previous year questions on the YouTube live. And finally, followed by this, we'll have the full-length test papers, which is available to everyone. And you will have to appear for this, followed by discussion of the paper. This is basically the 4-point program that we have provided for you, or that we'll be providing for you in the next 90 days to achieve your dream of clearing the civil services examination prelims. Now, under that first component, these are the topics, or these are the subjects on which the strategy for the next 90 days will be discussed, starting with the Polity subject. That is, on the 1st of March today, Mr. Sarmad Mehraj, or Sarmad sir, will be taking up what is the strategy for the next 90 days that you're supposed to follow to prepare for the Polity paper. Now, with this caveat, let's start the discussion of the topic today. The topic that we'll be discussing is, as already mentioned, what has happened to the growth rate for the third quarter of the current financial year. Let's start with basics first. The third quarter represents the time period for 3 months, that is October, November and December. Now, for those of you who do not know the basic idea, it's very simple. A financial year will start from the 1st of April and will go until the end of March next year. And this financial year of 12 months will be broken down into 4 quarters of 3 months each. The first quarter, 3 months, same for second quarter, third quarter and fourth quarter. By the way, we are basically in the fourth quarter of financial year 23 now. And because we have already completed the third quarter of the current financial year, which starts from month of October and ends with December, the data for this month was published very recently, that is yesterday, by NSO, National Statistical Office. Now, what are the important points? First and foremost, NSO functions under Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, MOSPI. Please remember that. Point number 2, the data for GDP is provided for every quarter as well as for financial year. That is, for the full financial year, the data, that is the GDP value as well as the growth rate, is published. And for every quarter, the GDP value as well as the growth rate is published. Now, some of you will be confused with GDP value and growth rate. It's very simple. GDP value, whenever I refer to that, or simply GDP, it's what is the market price of all the final goods and services which are produced. But when I say GDP growth rate, we are comparing 2 time periods. For example, the time period for October to December, that is the third quarter of current financial year, what is the GDP value? Compare that with the same quarter of last financial year. For example, let's take a simple number here. Let's say for the same time period last year, the value of GDP was, let's say, 100 crore. And now this year, it is 110 crore rupees. We will simply refer to this as having achieved a 10% growth rate or 10% GDP growth rate. Of course, there are different types or there are different ways to calculate it. There is one nominal, then there is a real, etc., etc. Now, what is the important point here? Point number one, have a look at the GDP value for the third quarter of financial year 23. It has registered a growth rate of 4.3%. Now, the point that you need to observe is very simply, this represents a third quarter, and in this quarter, there has been a slowdown in the GDP growth rate. That is, for the first quarter in the current financial year, we achieved a growth rate of more than 13%. In the second quarter, 6.2%, and the third quarter, 4.3%. Various experts have raised a concern over the slowdown or the lower GDP growth rate which has been registered by the third quarter. Now, whenever you come across the GDP, generally remember this, GDP is calculated using three methods. One is a production method, second one is the expenditure method, and the third one is income method. But whenever the calculations are given by NSO, we use two methods here. One is the production method and the second one is the expenditure method. For example, in this slide, if you look at the data, the table 2 will provide you the GDP value through production methodology, and basically the table 1 will provide the GDP value through expenditure method. Do you need to by heart or mug up any of these numbers? Absolutely no. Please do not waste your time. Why? By the time you write the exam, the data would have already changed and it's dynamic numbers, so you do not have to remember any of this data. But the question again arises, what has happened? Why certain set of experts are saying this is a dangerous trend, this is a warning signal for Indian economy, and certain set of experts are saying nothing wrong with it, this was expected. If you look at the Reserve Bank of India's recent publication, this was actually expected, and in fact even in the fourth quarter there is expected to be a slowdown, but overall for the full financial year we are going to achieve around 7% GDP growth rate. Now let's try and find out what has actually happened. Why this growth rate that Indian economy has achieved has stagnated or has hit around 4.4%. The first and the most important factor that you need to remember, even for examination purposes, is the idea of a base effect. Right? The concept of base effect. Now, what is this idea of a base effect? As already mentioned, I told you, whenever you calculate GDP, for example, the third quarter for current financial year 23, we are comparing the GDP value of third quarter for current financial year with the same quarter of previous financial year. Now, let's say hypothetically, it is 100 crore rupees, and for third quarter in current financial year, it is 110 crore rupees. Now, the growth rate will be how much? 10%. Growth rate would have been 10%. But here's a very important point. NSO will keep on revising the data. NSO, National Statistical Office, will keep on revising the data for a very simple reason. Whenever data is published like this, some of the data will be arriving to it a bit later, or there will be certain corrections made in the later phases. That is the precise reason the revision of the data will be done. And what is the importance of this point here? Follow this carefully. The NSO has very recently revised the growth rate for the financial year 22, which means whatever was the GDP value for the financial year 22, it has been revised from 8.7%. Now it has been revised upwards to 9.1%. Now some of you will ask me, sir, what is the impact of that? If it has been revised upwards, what is the impact of that on the GDP growth rate in the third quarter of current financial year? Follow the next point here. In this calculation that I've taken, I said, imagine the GDP value is 100 crore rupees. And this 100 crore rupees will be taken as a base to calculate what is the growth rate for the third quarter in current financial year. Now, what if I revise this base upwards? That is, again, please understand, it can be revised upwards as well as downwards. But what if I revise it upwards to, let's say, 105 crore rupees? Now, if I revise it upwards to 105 crore rupees, what do you think will happen automatically to the GDP growth rate, the GDP growth rate will automatically come down. And in this case, you do not have to calculate. I'll just throw an approximate number here. It will be somewhere around 4.5%. Whatever is the exact number, please don't worry. Which means if the base is revised upwards, I repeat, if the base is revised upwards, what will happen to the growth rate here? The growth rate automatically will come down. And various economists have basically pointed that this is the reason why the GDP growth rate for the third quarter has actually come down, has actually registered at 4.4%. Because if you just look at this particular graph, have a look at this. Earlier for the third quarter, the GDP growth rate was something else. Now it has been revised upwards to 5.2%, which is present here also, which has been revised upwards to 5.2%. As a result of this base effect, the GDP growth rate has got or has reached 4.4%. Now what if this revision was not done? Various experts pointed out that if this revision was not done, the third quarter GDP growth rate has or would have been somewhere around 5.1%. 5.1%. That's the first very important point. Please remember this. Base effect, very important for the exams. It can be asked even in the context of inflation, can be applied in the context of GDP, etc., etc. Whenever you calculate indices, any indice that you talk about, base effect is generally included in the calculation or is one of the concepts which is relevant to calculation of indices. So whatever you discuss or whatever you come across regarding the third quarter GDP numbers, take it with a pinch of salt. Why? There is an impact of base effect here. Now second, this is a concern, contraction in the manufacturing sector. Please have a look at it. If you look at the manufacturing sector, for the second quarter, there was a contraction by 3.6%. And in the third quarter, the contraction is there, but luckily, or this is a saving grace, or let's say the silver lining here, the contraction has actually come down to 1%. And manufacturing sector is very much relevant, right? It's very much relevant. And many of the experts have pointed out one of the reasons why manufacturing sector has contracted in the third quarter is because of events that are taking place in the global market. We'll connect to the global market also in some time. But apart from the manufacturing sector, you could also see that the service sector, the growth in the service sector, no doubt, it is 6%. It's on a higher level. But if you compare it to the previous quarters, the growth rate has actually come down, even in the service sector. That is again one more cause of concern. And as usual, agriculture continues to be a bright spot in the Indian economy and has registered a growth rate of 3.7% in the third quarter. Now, one more very important concern, what has happened to the consumption? Because like I said earlier, GDP can be calculated through expenditure method and through production method as well. Now, just now we have seen what has happened to the GDP components through production methodology, now through expenditure methodology. Now, the most important point of concern which many experts have raised is the expenditure in the form of PFCE. PFCE basically stands for Private Final Consumption Expenditure, and this is very much important. Why? Whenever you calculate GDP through expenditure method, the most important ones are the private final consumption expenditure, the government expenditure, the investment done by the companies, as well as imports and exports. Now, if you look at this breakup, most of it, that is around 60% of the GDP under the expenditure method comes through PFCE, Private Final Consumption Expenditure. That is the expenditure on goods and services done by Indian households. And what has happened here? The private final consumption expenditure no doubt has grown, but the growth rate has actually slowed down compared to previous quarters. That's very, very important. And this, right, whenever you look at this in the prism of, let's say, urban as well as rural, you will realize that slowdown in case of this is problem for Indian economy. You will have to remember this. It's a problem for Indian economy. Why? This contributes more than 60%. And if this starts slowing down, automatically the GDP will also have an impact, or the GDP number will also be affected by this. Apart from this, The government expenditure also has contracted, and many experts have stated this is because Government of India wants to control the fiscal deficit. Various prudential measures are being undertaken by the government. This could have happened because of that. And the private expenditure, private investment, that is represented in gross fixed capital formation or proxy for private sector investment, there is also slowdown there. And apart from this, one more component, like I said, is the export component, the imports as well as exports. Now focus on exports here. Exports in recent times have been affected by the slowdown that is being experienced by the global market. And that is again a cause of concern. Why? Exports have a multiplier effect. In essence, exports will not only contribute to GDP, it will also contribute to earning of forex reserves, creation of employment, etc., etc. And recent times, what is happening in the global market such as European market, USA market, it's a cause of concern for Indian economy. So these are some of the reasons why the GDP value, right, or GDP growth rate registered for the third quarter is at 4.4%. Now what is the inference that you need to draw out of all of this discussion? One, will it put a lot of pressure on Reserve Bank of India? Why? That is also very important. Reserve Bank of India very recently has increased the interest rates. And with the rise in the interest rates, automatically investment in the market is affected. It will have a limiting impact on the GDP in the economy. Now all the eyes will be on the monetary policy which will be announced by the Reserve Bank of India in the coming months. That is in the month of April. The concern is that if RBI focused on controlling inflation will further increase interest rate, that will lead to further reduction in the investment, reducing the GDP value of India. And second, what should be the growth rate for the fourth quarter then? Right, because understand this, for the current financial year, we have estimated a growth rate of 7%. And if you look at the third quarter, the growth rate is around 4.4%, which means for the fourth quarter, we should be able to achieve a growth rate of more than 5% in order to achieve overall GDP value or overall GDP growth rate of more than 7% or even nearer to 7% for the current financial year, which many of the economists are concerned might not happen. So these are the various important points that you need to understand in the context of the announcement of 4.4% GDP growth rate for the third quarter for the current financial year. If you like the initiatives that we have launched for you, please hit the like button. Provide your valuable comments in the section below. And if you are yet to subscribe to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS, kindly do it now. Thank you. Have a great day.